All right, let's dive into this data sovereignty thing, huh? You've sent over some intriguing stuff from the Department of Technology, specifically their Data Sovereignty Act. Seems like you're curious about how states are trying to manage all our data in this digital world.
Well, everyone's talking about it, right?
It's true. It's everywhere and nowhere all at once. It's like you're listening to this deep dive on your phone, right?
Right.
Using an app probably designed somewhere else,
Rare.
maybe even buying something online from, who knows, across the country. And all the while, your data is flitting through servers. Who knows where?
Exactly. And that's what makes this act so interesting. It's like a tug of war.
A tug of war.
Yeah, between states wanting more control, over the data made within their borders.
Okay.
But then we also need some kind of national standard, right? Especially when data crosses state lines faster than,
Or caffeinated hummingbird.
exactly, like a caffeinated hummingbird. Article 1, that's where they get into it. They really zero in on giving states the power
The power to.
to be the primary protectors
Detectors.
of the data created within their borders.
Oh, so each state gets to be like the sheriff of its own data.
Exactly. They're even using residency as the basis for jurisdiction. So say you live in Florida.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Florida's laws would apply to your data, even if the company you're dealing with is off in California.
That makes sense for me, for an individual, but what about companies? Imagine having to deal with 50 different sets of data laws. It'd be chaos.
It'd be a logistical nightmare, for sure. That's why they're encouraging states to get on the same page a bit.
So it's not a complete free-for-all?
No, no. They're pushing for collaboration, maybe some model legislation, but the states still get to be in charge of their own data.
Okay, so how does this affect me on a Tuesday? Scrolling through my phone, maybe ordering takeout. What's the impact?
That's what's so interesting, because this act isn't just about the states, right? It's about giving you, the individual, more control
More control
over
over...
your own data.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Article 7, that's the heart of it. They lay out some important consumer rights, like you'd have the right to know how a company is using your data, even ask for access to it. Request corrections.
So no more shady algorithms or mystery data collection.
Exactly.
Ooh.
And it ties into their emphasis on transparency.
Transparency, how so?
It's all in Article 6. They're all about public accountability.
Yeah.
All those data decisions, any disputes, open for the public to see. Very much like the First Amendment, really.
I'm into that. Speaking of transparency, how about voter data? There's been a lot of talk about that lately. How does this act deal with personal information during elections?
That's so relevant right now. It's right there in Article 7. They talk about voter rights, duty transparency, informed consent, how data is collected, stored, used, the whole 9 yards. The voters have a right to know how their information is being handled, especially in elections, right?
It's interesting. It seems like they're responding to all these anxieties around data privacy, possible manipulation, especially after recent elections. Like they're building a system to address those very fears.
Absolutely. And this leads directly to what I find so fascinating, this idea of future-proofing.
Future-proofing. Okay, now you have my attention. How do you future-proof something like data, especially with technology changing so quickly?
The million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Well, Article 8 mandates that states have to review their data governance laws annually.
Annually, wow, that's...
Huge, right?
Hmm.
Because you're right, technology is constantly evolving. What's the world going to look like next year? Data regulation can't just be a set of rules, right? It needs to be flexible, adapt to these new technologies.
So, like, we can't predict the future, but we can be ready for whatever it throws at us.
Exactly. And then Article 9X, that outlines the amendment process, if they need to make changes to the framework itself.
There's a way to do that.
A built-in system, yeah. States can come together, make adjustments. It's a living document, constantly adapting.
Walking a tightrope, huh?
In a way, yes. Try to balance giving states control, but also having some consistency across the country.
But what about internationally? Data doesn't exactly stay put.
That's where things get really interesting. You said it. It's like trying to, I don't know, put those caffeinated hummingbirds in tiny little airplanes. Passports, customs, the whole bit.
And with each state being in charge of its own data, what happens when those rules clash with, say, the EU?
Yeah.
With their really strict privacy laws? Talk about a digital standoff.
It's a recipe for a showdown, especially for those big companies working globally. They could be caught in the middle of this tug of war.
So we want to give people more control over their data, right? But are we accidentally making the internet a bunch of walled-off digital countries? Fragmentation, is that what they call it?
The big question, right? Streamlining versus a digital maze. It's a tricky balance to strike.
Does this act even deal with those international data transfers? Seems like a big missing piece.
You've hit the nail on the head. The act is mostly focused on the U.S. right here. It doesn't really dive into that international data sea. It probably needs some agreements with other countries to figure that out.
So they've built this framework for the US, but the rest of the world is like, hello, over here, a bridge to nowhere almost.
That's one way to put it. And that's where the headaches start. Imagine a company stuck between U.S. data laws and the EU's GDPR. Two sets of rules potentially contradicting each other.
Talk about a legal nightmare. It seems like this act, while well-intentioned, could create some real problems. So is there a way to balance this state control with, global standards?
That's a million-dollar question. And it's what everyone's trying to figure out. Policymakers, techies, everyone. It's a tough one.
This is where you come in, dear listener. This isn't just about being good with computers. It's about being a savvy citizen in this digital world.
Exactly. Your data is zipping around the globe. You should know what's happening to it.
It's about asking the right questions, staying informed, and speaking up. At the end of the day, this isn't just about data points. It's about how we deal with a future where information is power.
Well said. And that brings us to another big one, enforcement. Passing a law is one thing, but making it work, making companies accountable, that's a whole other story.
Especially with companies working across state lines, even internationally. It's like trying to catch digital shadows.
It's a huge challenge, and the Act knows it. It's up to each state to enforce its own laws, even if the company isn't physically there.
But how? Do they have, digital detectives?
Not quite. It's going to take teamwork, sharing information, maybe some creative lawyering. We'll have to see how it plays out in the real world.
A wait-and-see situation. But there's another part of this whole enforcement thing, the individual's role. It's not just about states going after companies. It's also about giving individuals the power to take control of their own data.
Exactly. Article 7, remember, is not just about consumer rights. It also lets individuals report violations, even sue, if their data rights are violated.
So we're like the data deputies now. But what does that look like in reality?
It means you got to know your rights, understand what a violation is, and not be afraid to report anything fishy. Be proactive, not just along for the ride.
We're not just waiting for the data police. We are the data police, standing up for our digital rights. So we've covered a lot of ground here. This Data Sovereignty Act, the good, the bad, the how do we actually make it work. But what's the takeaway for the average person listening right now?
It boils down to this. This act could really shake things up. How your data is handled, how you deal with companies online, everything.
It's getting real, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. It's not just legal jargon anymore. Think of it this way. The act basically says states get to be the big bosses of data made within their borders.
So my state government gets to tell companies what they can and can't do with my data.
Potentially, yeah. More rights, more protection at the state level.
But there's always a but.
It could create a kind of digital patchwork. Like, if you're in one state, things are one way, but you cross the border, digitally speaking.
Things get messy.
Exactly. And then there's the enforcement. States are supposed to make sure these rules are followed, even for companies outside their borders.
Easier said than done, right?
100%.
Yeah.
It's a real head-scratcher. Can states actually do that? Keep those companies in check, especially if they're across the country or even international? Big questions.
And don't forget about us, the users. This act isn't just about states versus companies. It's about giving us, individuals, more of a say in our own data.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right? You got to know your rights, when those rights are being violated, and then what? You don't stay silent, report it.
We're not just handing over our data anymore. We're active participants, right? We're aware, we're informed, we're engaged.
Exactly. This isn't just about ones and zeros. It's about you, your choices, your life reflected in the digital world. And this act, it's a huge step, a starting point for this crucial conversation about data, how it's used, who controls it.
A call to action, almost.
Exactly. Stay informed, stay engaged, ask those questions. What does data sovereignty mean to you? How should your data be protected? What rights do you deserve in this digital age?
Because in the end, your voice matters. That's what this all boils down to. Your data, your rights, your future. Thanks for diving into this with us. And until next time, stay curious.